This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our next session, China Direct. Will the EU rekindle its ties with China? We're very delighted to have two guests joining us here in person. Mr. Raphael Glucksmann, a French MEP from the S&D Group, and Mr. Gunnar Wiegand, who is the Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific from the European External Action Service. Forgot to introduce myself, obviously. I'm Stuart Lau, your host and moderator in this panel, and I'm also the EU-China correspondent for Politico Europe. Joining us online is Ms. Janka Ertel, who is the Director of Asia Program and Senior Policy Fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Obviously, EU-China relations is getting a lot of attention these days. Gunnar and I were just coming back from Singapore, where we went to the Shangri-La Dialogue with a lot of exchanges about US and China and the Indo-Pacific, but also Europe, and delivering a perspective of Europe. And whereas in the European Parliament, we're also seeing a very busy agenda on all the policy initiatives that will touch upon, the growing geopolitical influence of China and what the European Union will be doing in response to that. Without further ado, I'd like to begin with Mr. Glucksmann, actually, to talk a little bit more about the next big thing on the European Parliament agenda, which is the forced labor ban. I mean, tell us more what your expectation is and how that impacts the European business community, please.
So first, thank you so much for the invitation. I think it's a very timely discussion. And yes, we have a lot of things coming in the European Parliament that will affect the EU-China relations. And one of these big things is the import ban or the withdrawal mechanism, market withdrawal mechanism, that will be presented by the Commission in September. And we just had a vote in the European Parliament making clear what we expect from the Commission. And it was a very rare moment of unanimity in the European Parliament to ban the products of forced labor from entering European markets. And this is a very clear political signal that in our House there is a raising awareness of the need for Europe to actually get the right instrument in place in order to stop being naive when it comes to the Chinese relation and especially in trade. And we have a very big change and shift in the Parliament, but also, I must say, in the Commission. All the last texts we have voted were texts that creates a very different framework in Europe when it comes to trade, and especially to trade with China. And this is the end of history. We know that rivalry exists, that geopolitical antagonism exists, that maybe we were naive and blind for a very long period, but now we need to be able to defend both our principles and our long-term interest. And for sure, our long-term interest is not to accept that hundreds of thousands of slaves will produce our shirts and our shoes. And this is why it's a very important moment, and I'm quite confident that the European Union will send the right signal both to Beijing and to its own citizens, that it can defend principles and interests at the same time.
Surely your main focus in the Parliament is about how to do business with a strong focus on human rights. Tell us more about your recent trip to Taiwan as well and your exchanges with Taiwan. Obviously, the EU has a one-China policy, and how does the European Parliament maneuver within this framework? I mean, to stick to the diplomatic direction you have with the PRC, but also expanding ties with Taiwan.
Yeah, and we had, I will not betray any secrets, we had very long and nice conversation with my friend Gunnar on this, because it was the first ever official delegation from the European Parliament to Taiwan. And obviously it was quite sensitive, especially since I am under sanction by the Chinese regime. And our point is very clear. We need more relation with Taipei. And the more we engage with Taipei, actually the least chance we have to have a war in the Detroit. And that's the contrary to what people might spontaneously think. They might think that if we do provocation, then obviously Beijing will respond with force. But having ties with Taipei is not a provocation. And on the contrary, what it sends as a signal is that we care about peace in the Detroit, and that we care about Taiwanese democracy. And the more relation we will build with Taipei, I think the more we will contribute to lowering the tensions and the temptation in Beijing to wage a war. And just to be clear, I think that there is a direct impact in Beijing of the war in Ukraine. And the policy we have towards Ukraine is also sending a message to China on Taiwan. The idea is, if we allow Putin to win his war and to actually grab Ukraine and put an end to Ukrainian democracy, then this is absolutely the wrong signal sent to authoritarian Chinese Communist Party on Taiwan. While if we help Ukraine to resist and to show the world that you cannot have this kind of war of aggressions and that they fail, then this is the right message, also very far away from Ukraine and thousands of kilometers away from there.
Let's move on to Gunnar Vegan. We've just heard Raphael talk about the end of history. Is that the kind of feeling you get from Shangri-La in Singapore, for example, where people focus less about globalization, but really focusing more about trading with your like-minded partners? Is that the future we're entering into here?
It may be my advanced age, but I don't believe in end of history. When I came to the Commission in 1990, I was the East Germany desk officer. We have helped to bring East Germany to unite with the rest of Germany. We brought an important part of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon members to become members of the European Union. And yes, perhaps for a very long time we thought war is a story of our fathers and grandfathers. It is not. There's war now at the borders of 4 of our member states. So we have to be careful that our democracies, our market economies are resilient and that also all security challenges are properly catered for. I think there's an awakening here in Europe and in many other parts of the world. And what Raphael referred to certainly was very predominant at the Shangri-La dialogue, that the challenges and risks for security and prosperity which exist in Europe exist exactly in the same way in the Indo-Pacific, which is by far the most dynamic area in economic terms. And we have every interest to be closely linked to many partners in that wide area, but we need to be aware also of the high fragility in security and policy terms of that area, which means, and I will end with this at this first question, that the key challenge for Europe is to become more resilient by using its own means, its own possibilities as the largest integrated single market, to reduce critical dependencies, to diversify, to reduce risks means to work with like-minded, but not only to work with like-minded. We need to work with many partners around the world, and it requires that we have a capacity to innovate, but it also requires a capacity to diversify in critical technologies and on raw materials where we very highly depend on some providers. And I recommend to everybody to read the blog of Commissioner Breton of 12th of June, where he points at the critical dependencies we have, exactly where we want to go to: green transition, digital transition. As High Representative Borrell says, do we exchange one critical dependency on fossil fuels with another critical dependency?
Just one more question before we move to Janke. How do you see the China-Russia relations right now? The last time we had the EU-China summit on April 1st, President von der Leyen made it very clear that China shouldn't be helping the EU circumvent sanctions or provide arms for Russia. 2 months on, how do you see the development between China and Russia moving, and how does that affect EU-China relations as well?
Of course, we take note that there was a very cordial telephone conference at the occasion of the birthday of President Xi Jinping yesterday between President Putin and Xi Jinping. The relationship between the two leaders could not be closer. Let's be clear about that. And this was expressed also in very many concrete ways in the very long, 11 pages long, 4 February joint statement between Russia and China. That has been a watershed, I would say, in that relationship. China has bought into the security argumentation of Russia when it comes to European security, and vice versa. Russia subscribes now to the Chinese interpretation of the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific area. The friendship without limits has been established, and the common conviction is that both countries know best what democracy is and what rule of law is and what human rights are, because they are practicing them for thousands of years. This, however, as our Chinese partners, strategic partners of the EU, tend to lately emphasize much more than some time ago, does not mean that China is in an alliance with Russia. And that the string of special envoys have underlined this recently. I think that there is a conundrum, there's an embarrassment, because Russia so very clearly violates the core principle of the United Nations Charter, Article 2, territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence, inviolability of internationally recognized borders. Russia does this after probably having given only a very scarce explanation of the special operation it was intending to do, and China has no interest in having a deglobalization, as was so nicely said at the Davos Economic Forum, happening. It is in the interest of China to remain globally connected with as many economies, as many financial systems as possible. Not having this anymore would put into question the enormous gain which China has made over the last decades, getting hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty. China needs that international connection, and let us be clear, we have a trade volume of 700 billion, the highest ever trade in goods last year between the EU and China, the largest trade relationship in the world, plus about 85 billion in services, 100 billion bigger than the US-China relationship. This is economic interdependence. This gives leverage to both sides, not only to China, also to the EU. And we have to use this wisely.
Thank you very much, Gunnar. Janke, just to shed more light on the Chinese position on Ukraine. I mean, what's your observation? What's the kind of observation you have with your exchanges with Chinese officials, for example? Are they aware of their position on Ukraine and how that is actually impacting the sentiment here in Europe?
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you for the invitation. Sorry for not being there in person. I'm here with a bunch of China watchers currently in Stockholm in Sweden and joining you from the lunch break here of this big conference. I agree with a couple of points that Gunnar Wiegand has made, and I would disagree with a few. Let me start with the ones where I agree very much. I would say this is a watershed moment, not only for Russia-China relations, but also for EU-China relations, because this is the very first time that China is actively positioning itself against European security interests in a major security crisis. We have not seen this before. Previously, China has always made a point of being neutral, be it Georgia, be it Crimea. We've had these situations before, and we've not had this kind of Chinese reaction. There was a belief here in Europe, in many capitals in the first days of the war, that China would kind of come and save the day and could convince Putin to stop the war and could mediate and all sorts of things. And that has clearly not proven true. China has clearly decided that it is of a strategic advantage at the moment to side with Russia and to side relatively actively with Russia. And I think that's where we also agree. I think that phone call, again, every opportunity that the Chinese leadership gets to kind of potentially back away or be more careful about its siding with Moscow, it actually doubles down. The rhetoric becomes stronger. And I think we need to think through what that really means. What are the consequences for us? I think we saw some of that at the April 1st summit, at the EU-China summit, at the level that we were discussing there. I think we saw that this has real consequences for the relationship, and that it has a deterioration is the consequence necessarily. But we have to also think about the real big consequences of seeing Russia and China together as actors that are striving for a different kind of global order. That is not the kind of global order that we would like to wish for. And that's where I would disagree a little bit with Gunnar. I think there is embarrassment in parts of the Chinese system when it comes to the current situation. I don't think it is very much there at the top where it matters. I think there is a very clear assessment that under the current circumstances, this is strategically the best thing that China can do, that Beijing can do. Whether that is a good or a bad idea for the economy is a totally different story. But what we can empirically see at the moment is that the Chinese leadership currently values political goals, ideological goals higher than it does growth, than it does economic entanglement. And that's why I also would say, if that is the basis of our assessment, of saying the politics trumps the economy, then the whole question of economic interdependence becomes a very different one. Because if one side cares a lot less about this interdependence and is willing to sacrifice it for economic goals, then it matters just a lot less. And I think we have to adjust our policies and our kind of economic policies accordingly.
Just very briefly, I mean, in terms of Chinese politics, of course, the biggest thing happening this year will be the Communist Party Congress, where President Xi will take the helm for the third time. How does that relate to Europe? What should we here in Europe pay attention to?
We should probably pay attention to who else is going to be moved up in the ranks. We should see and keep an eye on what is happening with the prime minister position. We can see whether there is a recalibration in the system, whether the anger about the kind of economic policy that is clearly having an effect on China right now. We're clearly seeing an economic crisis brewing very much and already happening with growth numbers are really bad. Whether Xi Jinping is as stable in his leadership role that he has all of his loyalists in the roles that can be given out, or whether there is a kind of bureaucratic, technocratic movement where there is a greater presence of people that kind of recalibrate the system a little bit. I think overall we should not pay, like, this is not a moment where everything will flip or change. The process towards the party congress is interesting, and the process afterwards is going to be very interesting. How stable is Xi Jinping? How can he deal with the crises that are emerging internally, particularly when it comes to the zero COVID strategy and moving out of it potentially after the party congress?
Thanks very much, Janke. Before I open the floor to our audience here, any response to where Janke disagrees with you on, Gunnar?
Well, that's just a differentiation which a China specialist is, of course, more than entitled to do. That there are some parts in the Chinese system which are more embarrassed than other parts of the Chinese system. I have no difficulty with that differentiation. I would even agree. Where I would disagree with her is that ideology binds together Russia and China. Which ideology has the Russian Federation? Nobody can say. This is an oligarchic country which is authoritarian and which is moving, unfortunately, towards fascist behavior, at least inside Russia, if not also in its neighborhood. We have a Communist Party governing firmly China. There is no commonality between communism and that de facto situation in Russia. But there are two autocratic systems, and there are two strong leaders, and they have one common target, which is to make sure that the United States does not bother them, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific region or whether this is in Europe. Therefore, anti-NATO, therefore many other positionings now supported by Russia, by China in the Indo-Pacific. That is the commonality. So it is a temporary coalition, I would say, which is convenient for both, but I can't see the ideological fundament there.
And just Stuart, if you allow me to just really briefly, I wasn't making that point. I was saying in China, ideological goals are trumping at the moment over the economic policy. Political goals are trumping over the economy. There's certainly not the ideological dimension to the China-Russia relationship, but the kind of strategic, stable but not eternal relationship that we're seeing right now.
And I see that Raphael would like to chime in here.
Yes, because I agree there is no positive ideology that links them. And we can have doubts whether China is still communist or Russia is yet totally fascist or half fascist, but that's not what matters now. It's not like Cold War during this period where you had this communist ideology that was confronting liberal democracies and capitalist systems. Now, the link between them is hatred towards us. Actually, not only the US, because in Russia case, Europe is really the target also. And we should not underestimate how important this negative link is. And actually how performant and efficient it can be in the world. Because, for instance, I'm chairing the committee of the European Parliament on foreign interference in our democratic processes. And it's true that we managed to actually circumvent Russian propaganda and Russian efforts in our countries. But when you look at the world picture, when you look at Africa, when you look at South America, when you look at Asia, then you can understand how powerful this negative link of two autocratic systems challenging the liberal democracies is, because you have a lot of elites around the world that have no interest in promoting liberal democracies, so they will go to this negative alliance, and you have also a resentment against the West all over the places. And they will exploit that to the end. But what's the end? That's the truth difference maybe between both. Russians are ready to blow up everything in order to make us lose, while China has more to lose, so maybe they will end up, and I guess that's your hope, with a more rational approach at the end. But this negative connection is super strong, and we tend to underestimate this strength here.
Thank you, Raphael. Is there any question from the audience here? Yes, please.
Thank you. When the EU has put sanctions on Russia, I learned that 85% of civilian aircraft in Russia are Airbus and Boeing. Last week, I was pretty surprised to learn that China forbid Russian airplanes type Boeing and type Airbus to fly over China and to land in China. So where's the limit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend approach?
The message which Stuart Lau referred to at the beginning, or was it Juncker, I can't remember anymore, was very clear at the EU-China summit that if the Chinese leadership wants to avoid that the Russian aggression against Ukraine becomes a negative factor for the development of EU-China relations, it has to avoid, to circumvent sanctions imposed on Russia for its aggression, and it has to not support the Russian war effort with whatever means. And we have seen that China has so far operated along those lines to avoid any damage. If they would now let Russian airplanes land with the way you have just described, there would be an immediate problem. We have seen it recently with Sri Lanka, where a Russian airplane was operated. These are under sanctions. So there is a price to be paid then. And that, I think, the Chinese leadership is not ready to pay.
If I can add, I think there's a minimalist approach that the Chinese leadership is taking at the moment, that is as much as we can, but not so much that it would hurt us more than anyone else. And I think that is a very logical approach to be taken. But there's two sides to this. And I think what Raphael Glucksmann just said is really, really, really important, because it brings us to the point of what is actually a red line, what really matters. So does it matter whether China supports Russia militarily with weapons in the war and provides active sanctions evasion, or is actually the little things, the invisible things, the actors that are not exposed to the international markets that are propping up the Chinese regime, the effect that the international narrative creation actually has using China's media power there, is that not actually propping up the Russian regime already so much more? Is that not stabilizing the regime so much more? So in a way, I'm trying not to be too rowdy here on the panel, but are we not sending a faux red line where we say, the Chinese are never going to provide military support directly, and so long as we can say, if you don't do that, then we won't sanction you? How do we evaluate what actual support means right now, and do we not have to reassess that at this point? I think that's a really important question where we have to ask ourselves, what is stabilizing Putin at the moment? How do we measure all of the things that China is doing that are below the level of active sanctions evasion? How can we get to that?
Just one last final question for Rafael and Gunnar. One of the prominent features over the last few years about EU-China relations is actually this transatlantic relationship under the Biden administration. What if Trump comes back? What's going to happen for the EU? How should we approach China with the US? Rafael?
Well, actually, that's a question that's asked not only for the EU-China relations, and that's why we are discussing so much in the European Parliament and in the institutions in general about strategic autonomy of the European Union. It's not at all an anti-American discussion to speak about strategic autonomy. It's just that as grown-up persons and citizens and consumers of the first market in the world, very rich societies, stable, democratic for most of them at least, we cannot have this experience every 4 years where we stop sleeping at night and look at elections in Michigan, in counties we never heard about, to know if Riga and Vilnius are safe. I mean, this is basically madness and shameful. So what we need to do is to be able to survive even if Trump is there and Putin is still there and Xi Jinping is still there. And for that, that's what the point I wanted to make beyond the Michigan half joke. We need to get our act together, grow up, get our instruments done. All the instruments we are discussing now are not targeting China per se. They are instruments that we give to Europe in order for Europe to be stronger and to have teeth. Of course, it will have a huge impact on China relations. But we need to be able to shape our own strategy alone and in alliance with our partners when they have a partnership mind. And this is really important for us to understand that we live in very unstable times, and what if Russia had invaded Ukraine with Trump in the White House? What would have happened? And that we don't have a response to that, and so we cannot depend on this question. So, and just to finish, the way we handle Putin on Ukraine will have a direct impact on China. And I'm sure that Chinese leadership is not so much worried about Russia, what is Russia doing. They despise, in a way, Russia. So what they are looking at, it's us. Are we strong enough to react in a strong manner to Vladimir Putin's aggression on the European soil? Are we strong enough to make him lose? Or are we weak enough to accept his aggression? And if we are weak enough, then they will bully us too. And that's why the way we handle Ukraine has a direct impact also on the Pacific, and it should be a European way to handle it.
Right. Gunnar, any final thoughts in 30 seconds or so?
As a former spokesman of Commissioner Chris Patton, I learned never answer hypothetical questions, so I will not answer to this. I just remind that the EU-US dialogue on China and the EU-US Trade and Technology Council were proposed to the US administration when was President Trump in the White House. They agreed to set it up. We set it up, but then we exercise this now with the Biden administration. Having said this, it is clear that we disagree with important features of the China policy which was pursued by President Trump. For example, unilateral measures which are WTO non-conform, and we will certainly continue to work for the best European interest.
Well, after all the bad news, the good news is that we'll be off to a lunch break now. But before that, thank you so much, Tianga Erto, joining us online from Berlin. And thank you also to Raphael Glucksmann and Gunnar Wiegen. We'll see you at 2:30 with the next panel by Samuel Stilton on Europe's arms wrestling contest with big tech. So stay tuned. Thank you so much.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.